Hello, Virginia Tech. I'm Adam Morgan, Executive Creative Director at Adobe. I'm here broadcasting from the Adobe office in Lehi, Utah. Sorry I couldn't be out there in person, but of course we've got coronavirus that's causing a bunch of mayhem. Regardless, no virus is going to stop us from spreading great ideas. So that's what I'm here today, is to share my journey in researching my book over the last 5 to 7 years. So let's get started. Today, many are talking about the intersection of humanity and technology. And while there's a lot of discussion around everything from EQ to how that affects artificial intelligence, really what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk to you about creativity. And I'm going to break it down and explain how it's actually closer to the world of data and technology than you think. So we're not so far off, like man and machine can work together. We're going to go through a lot of my research and talk about what I've found out for my book. And then I'm going to go through and explain some real-world examples so you can see how this works in marketing or in research and beyond. But it starts with a story. So 7 years ago, my entire journey to figuring out this intersection of creativity and data started when I was working at an ad agency before I was at Adobe. I had a client, and he worked for a regional bank. And I was pitching a bunch of billboard ideas to him. And there was a question that he asked that was really, really important. Because as he was looking at all these ideas, like we had super creative billboards and then more straightforward billboards. And as he looked at them, he said something very profound. He said, "Adam, how do I know if these creative ideas really work?" And I know many of us in marketing have always wondered, will my ideas work? But he was asking it in a different way because his boss was a sales guy and did not believe in marketing at all. And what he really wanted, what Russell Fisher wanted, was an answer to the age-old question of, do creative ideas work better? He wanted to know, how do I prove to my boss and anyone else up the chain that if we go with a creative idea, it's actually going to improve the bottom line? It's not just for fun, it's not just window dressing, but it's profoundly more effective in marketing. And that was the question he asked. And why this is an important question is because this question has been plaguing us since the 70s, since the creation of the modern creative marketing movement. And really this is how it goes, because even back when I started in the mid-90s in my career, it was all about agencies or companies that were battling it out over whether creative ideas were better and branding was better, or if direct marketing and strategy and data was better. And it's been going on for decades. Even today, which one is going to work, which one is not going to work. And oftentimes either side of this argument have tried to prove it out through case studies. They'll say, oh, Apple did this ad campaign and it was really successful, therefore creativity works. But someone else would take that same campaign and they would say, no, it was because of the data or the research, and that's what made the campaign work. So really for decades we've been at this impasse. Do creative ideas really impact the bottom line of business? That's the question we're trying to ask. And when Russell, my client, asked that question to me, I went on this search through books and research and studies, and I found my mentor, and we studied this for 2 years to try and find an answer for him. And at the end of the day, we could not find an answer. And so what I want to do today is answer that question, but here's the catch. Normally through marketing, the way we do it, again, like I said, is through examples, but I'm not going to use any case studies. Instead, I'm going to focus completely on science and neuroscience and hard science, because I feel like this answer has to be solid. It can't be subjective, because far too often in marketing, or at least in advertising in my world, it's super subjective. So I want to prove it out, prove why creative ideas, why design, why emotions are better for the bottom line. And let me clarify, because I just said two things, creativity and emotions. Throughout this presentation, I'm going to refer to these two things interchangeably. Creativity is the same thing as an emotional experience, because if you think about what, at least in my line of business, creativity has always been about searching for those human connections, searching for that emotional experience that an audience would have, and trying and create experiences or advertising or websites or emails that tap into those emotional hues. And that's really what we're going to go after. We're going to talk about how creative ideas really are emotional ideas, and then how that all works. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go through a lot of my research. I'm going to talk about the science behind creative marketing. And to be clear, I am not a neuroscientist. I did interview many of them and study and read through their articles, but I'm not a neuroscientist. So many of you who are in fields may know more about this, but I have vetted it out, so I know it's solid, but you could think of me more as like a pop scientist. So here we go. All right, we're going to talk about the brain for a little while. Now, many of us know the story of the two halves of the brain. You've got the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. And in reality, what we know is that left is more for denotation, meaning it's the sequence of events. Our left hemisphere is all about putting together a string of things that work together, and we've always called it more logical. And the right hemisphere is really all about connotation. And connotation is really all about filling in the gaps between those dots. So it's more of like filling in the punchline of a joke, like your right hemisphere is going to do that, whereas the left side is going to put the joke together, right? That's how these two halves work together. But the reality is, in more modern studies, we kind of have it wrong. I mean, the left and the right are certainly there and they help, but when it comes to being logical or creative, it's almost more of a story of the front and the back of the brain. The front of the brain, which is the prefrontal cortex, that's really like the princess of the industry right now, and that's really the thing that makes us different, that little lump right there behind our foreheads. That's what makes us different from a lot of hominids or monkeys or other animals, right? It's what we call our executive function. I like to call it the CEO of the brain. And really, it's what helps us, think logically. It helps us fear disease, have more emotions, put off decisions for later. Like there are a lot of things that are involved with that make us more human than many other things. But the truth is, it's not even still a discussion of the front of the brain and the back of the brain. I mean, really, if you just think of the brain as just a whole mess of connected neurons, I think 86 million to be precise. But there are many studies that show that it's not even a matter of parts. It's not like we're chopping up the cow and putting it into different cuts. Because, for example, there are stories of one girl who lost one whole half of her brain, and her other side that was remaining learned to rework itself so that it would create the same functions that were there in the missing half. So if it was a matter of her missing the right hemisphere, her left side grew and expanded and took over the functions that the other side should have done. There are also studies out there with, where the corpus callosum, the connection between the two halves, has been severed, or you were born without one. I mean, there's famous stories of people who have had that severed, and there was one man who, it's almost like the two halves of his brain worked independently. He could take a book and he could read, one eye would read one side of the book, the other eye would read the other, and he would process them separately, and he could burn through and remember everything from both sides. So the truth is this, I'm not going to be talking about parts of the brain, because I don't want to get into the depths of each individual part, like the amygdala and the cerebellum, all that kind of stuff. What I want to focus on is just the functions, or the things that happen within the brain. So right now, just think of it as a big mess of interconnected neurons. And the part that I want to bring together is this idea of logic and emotion. So how do we learn from the brain or from other studies and really understand that balance? Because that's really what we're talking about here. When I explained in the very beginning, when we were talking about creativity versus data, it's really this idea of logic versus emotion. Are we logical human beings, or are we more emotional, right? That's what we want to dig into. And so I want to start out with a question. And this is the question, obviously no one's here to answer that, but I want everyone just to think about your answer, which is, do you place more value on logic or emotion? And let me break that down a little bit so that I can give you some more context. If you think about how we've handled this question throughout history, all the way back to Descartes, where he would talk about how we had this little charioteer, which was logic, and it would drive animal instincts because it was more important and more valuable. And you look at even in our history books and how we've placed more value on someone who's a rational being, someone who's doesn't let the emotions cloud their judgment, and they can just be very rational and thoughtful about every decision they make. And that trend has really bled into many things, from the culture of our schools. Think of like the way our school is structured. It's all about logic. It's about memorizing facts, taking tests, A, B, C, D, putting one fact in front of another and making sure you know all the facts. And even in business, I look back at, right now if you look at the board of directors of many companies, most of them are made up from people who have either had a background in finance or operations or engineering. And if you think about them or MBAs, they went to school and they really trained their brains to focus on numbers and data and those more statistics and strategies that involve more of logic, right? And all along, we've always been saying, oh, the creativity is great, but creativity is more for those unique individuals who don't function like the rest of us, who aren't as rational, but they're more organic and zen. But I really want to break down that it's not necessarily like that. And maybe some of us have some of those biases. Like if I stop and think, I've heard many people in my line of work, if we have like a business problem, they'll say, okay, whoa, we just need to slow down and think about this logically, and then we'll reach the right conclusion. Then we'll find the right answer. So that's history. That's where we're at. But really we need to understand better this connection, and that's what I want to dig into, is that connection between logic and creativity, or emotion and logic, because it's really fascinating. So let's start this journey with a story. This is an image of Phineas Gage. And this happened back in, 1848 in Cavendish, Vermont. And the story goes like this. Phineas Gage, he was a foreman of a railroad crew where they were going through the mountains and they were blasting away the rock and laying a train track through the mountains. And the way they would do that is they would drill a hole in the rock and they'd put a bunch of black powder in there, and then they'd take these big tamping irons. If you look at the picture, he's holding this 6-foot rod, which is like a tamping iron. And they'd compact the black powder down in the hole, and then they'd put in a wire and run away and light it. And that's how they would blow up the rock to clear the way for the railroad track. Well, one day, Phineas Gage was working, tamping down the black powder when the rod struck the side of the rock and created a spark, and it blew up in his face. And that rod, without being too gory, shot up right up underneath his chin, right through his brain and out the top of his head. And in the process, blew out a huge chunk of his brain. Now here's the amazing part. Phineas didn't die. Phineas was still there when the doctor came. He was conscious and aware. Everything was great. They patched him up as best they could and went on his way. But here's the problem. Over time, Phineas changed. There was a chunk of his brain that was missing. And they didn't, back then they didn't know a whole lot about it. But it wasn't until 1994 when another professor came along, Antonio Damasio, and he wrote a book all about this because he had many patients in his department that he worked with that had the same part of their brains missing or damaged as Phineas Gage. Some of them, maybe it was because of another accident, or it was a tumor or something, but he knew what section of the brain was missing, and he studied them. And there are some fascinating things that we learned from Antonio's work. First of all, let's just talk about the people who had that part of their brain missing. What he found out is that section of the brain really controlled their emotions. So these people were logical, rational human beings, and he could deal with them just like people dealt with Phineas, but there was something different in them, and they would act more like robots than humans. And what he found, and this is the same with Phineas, is that his personality changed. And these people were incapable of making a decision. So if he would ask a simple decision like, all right, when do we want to have our next appointment? It's as if they would go back to square one, trying to do a pro and con list on every single decision. It's like they had no reference to anything that they'd made in the past, and they had a hard time making decisions in the present. So on that example, when's our next appointment? They would be like, all right, let's see, Tuesdays I'm usually in the city, but I usually have to take care of my kid on Wednesdays. And they'd go through this process again and again, even though they'd made the decision the last time they were with him. And this was the conclusion that Antonio came to. He said that a brain that cannot feel, meaning a brain that has no emotion, so we're just taking the logic half of this, a brain that cannot feel cannot make a decision. And that's pretty profound. A brain that cannot feel cannot make a decision. Let's hold on to that. Next, I want to talk about a different study. This was done by Cosmedy and Tooby, called evolutionary psychology. And what they wanted to find out is, all right, we look at it in evolution and how we're different from animals, and often we always talk about how emotional, emotions are what animals don't have, and therefore that's what makes us more animalistic, because we have too many emotions, or we're too into our feelings, right? Again, back to the whole history of if you're logical and rational, you can push down those animal instincts or those emotions. But this is what they found out. They found, in fact, it was the opposite. They found out that we actually have way more emotions than animals, and that's what makes us human. We have the ability to fear disease. We have the ability to fall in love. We have the ability to talk and feel and think about things on a completely different level than animals. So emotions aren't what make us more animalistic. emotions are what make us more human and less like animals. So what is the takeaway from these two studies? The takeaway is that logic alone can't cut it. You cannot operate as a highly functioning human being without emotions. You can't just push it away, you can't repress it. It's integral, it's part of us, it's super important, and we have to learn to find the balance between logic and emotion rather than just say, let's just ignore emotion, ignore creativity, and let's just focus on rational business things. All right, so that's super, super important. Now what I do want to get into are the two systems. So if any of you have read many of the great minds out there from Kahneman and others on thinking fast and slow, whatever it may be, but the way that the scientific community has it now, instead of thinking about the parts of the left and the right brain, it's really about the different systems that we have. And we have a fast and a slow system, and this is how they've explained it. So the conscious system, which is really more of like your logic, that's slow, cognitive, and rational. We have to slow down and really think through things. But our subconscious, and I'm labeling it conscious and subconscious, think of it system 1, system 2, whatever you're into. But it's our subconscious, which is our fast system. It's fast, automatic, and emotional. And that's how we communicate through emotions. And it's super, super fast. And in reality, if you think about it, like in terms of conscious and subconscious, or system 1 and system 2, our rational thought, which is what we're aware of, is really only a small part of what's going on in our brain. It's like the iceberg principle. We're only aware of a small amount. But in reality, the heavy lifting, all the real computation, all the real thinking is happening in our subconscious. It's happening below the hood or below the water. And if you stop and think about it rationally, it's just, imagine if you had to consciously or rationally make yourself walk. You had to think of every ligament and every piece, every bone and muscle in your body and make it all stay in balance and work. Or if you had to rationally make yourself breathe. If you had to think about, bringing it all in and out, like chances are we would screw it up because we're not good at the things that we're rationally thinking about, and we'd probably kill ourselves. The stuff that's really easy, the stuff that doesn't kill us, like rocket science or engineering, that's the stuff that is handled by the lightweight thinking, which is our rational brain, rather than under the hood with our subconscious. And it's probably there so that we don't mess it up, right? It's going to happen, and the real thinking is going to take us and help us live. And without you just believing that, let me give you a few more studies that actually help explain how this all works. So there was a famous study done by George A. Miller, and it was called The Magical Number 7, Plus or Minus 2, Some Limits to Our Capacity. I know it's something that rolls right off the tongue. Great study. But what he learned is that our conscious brain really can only hold a few variables at a time. And there is actually a newer study done by the University of Missouri that found out that it's actually closer to 3 to 5 chunks of data. So really, your conscious brain can only hold a few variables. And that's why your slow system really has to think about those things. It can't multitask. We talk about multitasking. That's not true. We're more multi-switching from one thing to another, but it's still just a few numbers. On the other hand, our subconscious, there was a recent study done by the Salk Institute that found out that it can hold up to multiple terabytes of data. And what they equated it to is our subconscious can hold the same amount of data as the entire internet. I mean, think about that. That is so much information. That's every YouTube video, every Facebook post, every Instagram post, every website, even the entire audio track of zombo.com. If you've ever been to there, I've never found the end of it. But all of that amount of data is what your brain can hold, your subconscious. So that's why our brains are so vast and amazing. They can handle a massive amount of data. So the takeaway here is your slow system, which is your logic system, can only hold a few variables, and your fast system, which is your subconscious, can hold a ton. Now, you may not believe me. You're like, oh great, Adam, those are a couple of studies. So I'm going to do a little test here with you. You are going to live right now in the present and test your fast and your slow system so you can see how this works, because this is important. The first thing I want to do is test your slow system, your logic. And here's how we're going to do it. I'm just going to click to the next slide, and I want you to do a little math problem for me. So here we go. And usually after a few seconds in the audience, someone will raise their hand and say, 578. And yes, that's the answer. But think about how long it took you, many seconds to go through that math problem. And that's an easy one. Now let's really test your slow system. This is a study that they use in the labs called the +1. And the way it works is like this. I'm going to give you a string of numbers. I'm going to go back so you don't see it now. I'm going to give you a string of numbers, and then you just have to simply take every number and add one digit to it. So if it's a 4, make it a 5. If it's a 3, make it a 4. And the catch is, this is testing how many of those variables you can hold in your mind. So think about phone numbers. That's why we break it up into chunks of 3 or 4, because we can handle data chunks of 3 or 4 and then move to the next thing and then remember that next thing. But if we string it all together in just one big long chunk, or if any of you have ever taken a true IQ test, and I'm not talking about the cheesy easy ones online where you just do a few trivia questions. That's not a real IQ test. But where it's really testing how many variables you can hold. So I'm going to flash you this number, and then I want you to look at the number, memorize it real quickly, and close your eyes, and focus on adding one digit to each of those numbers. Here we go. All right, that's it. Now add one digit to those numbers. I can't let it stay up because you've got to memorize it and hold it in your brain. Now, normally when I'm with an audience, this is what I see. I see a whole bunch of people kind of start on it and then just go, oh, forget it. Like, this is the worst. This is way too hard, right? And there are a few, stalwart people who will just sit there and think through it all and add the numbers in their head and then have the answer. But here's what's really happening in the lab. When we go through a test like this, first of all, your eyes dilate, your hands sweat. You have to focus on that string of numbers and really try and add one number, especially if you go on beyond 7 digits, right? And you have to push out all other activity and ignore everything else that's going on in your life and just really focus on that. That is your slow system. That is your conscious, logical system. That's how it works. It's not fast. It really has to crunch those numbers and really think about it, all right? Now I want to do a test with your fast system. So what I'm going to do differently here is I'm just going to show you an image. I'm not going to use any words, any numbers, anything. I'm just going to show you an image. And what I want you to do is I want you to focus on what you feel. I want you to focus on what is communicated to you just through feelings. Here we go. All right, so usually in a test like this, within seconds, people who see this Disney logo or Disney image, they either think about movies, they think about their experiences in the park or taking their kids to the park. They're flooded with all of these thoughts of what they've experienced around this brand. And it usually floods into their brain, and you can remember a ton of memories and information in a split second. So with that in mind, I'm going to show you one more. And then again, I want you to focus on with that knowledge, focus on what's communicated to you through your emotions. This is a bit more somber, and this is one event that happened at one time, but I guarantee anytime I talk to people, they can go back and say, oh man, I know exactly where I was standing, when I heard about 9/11, what was going on in my mind, if I called family, everything was going on. And it's such an emotional experience that you can completely recall everything that happened in a split second. So now that we understand those two systems, now that we understand our fast system and our slow system, and a lot of things that are going on in our brain as far as logic versus emotion, now I want to bring it all together and talk about how we make decisions based on both of those two systems. So let's start with another story. Imagine, if you will, you're at work. And you're done for the day, you go out and you get in your car, you turn on the keys, and you start driving. And you're thinking about work and everything that happened that day. And you're driving along, and all of a sudden you're home. And you have no idea how you got there. You don't remember making any decisions. And you're a little scared because you're like, oh, filth, I was out there on the road not even thinking. I could have crashed into someone, I wasn't paying attention. Right? It's very scary. And what we call that is autopilot. I'm sure many of you have been on autopilot. But now let's talk about that scenario in a different way. Now let's say you're driving home, deep in your thoughts, and all of a sudden you come across an accident. There's an ambulance, fire trucks, some cars that have crashed, and maybe as you're creeping past, time slows down completely, and you rubberneck like the best of them, and you look over to try and see if there's a body or carnage or just something because you want to see what's going on, right? In that instance, everything slows down and you remember all those moments versus the other example when you were on autopilot and didn't think about anything. Why is that? Why does that happen? The answer is because our brains are designed to predict, meaning this. There are a million bits of information flowing into our heads. If you look at it in terms of data, or a computer. All of your senses are input devices. So sight, sound, smell, touch. All of that is bringing in loads and loads of data into your head constantly. But the brain can't attend to everything. It cannot just remember every single thing that comes in. And in talking to neuroscientists, it's all about how much attention you pay to that data, right? The more you pay attention to certain things, the more it's locked in and you remember. And if you don't pay attention to it, then it's gone forever. And how do we know this? Let's give a few examples. Let's talk about our vision. So our vision, in reality, if you think about vision in front of you as like a screen of pixels, right? It's not taking in every single pixel around you. In fact, there's only like 2 cones that it's really like focusing in and bringing in that data. And the rest of it is all being predicted. If any of you have ever done the experiment where you stare at a blank wall and really focus on it for a long time, after a while your vision will just shut off. And the reason why is because there's no new information. There's no new data. There's nothing to attend to, so it just shuts off. Because it's just about predicting. So when you're in that car driving home, your subconscious has seen all of this stuff, and you don't have to focus on it because it doesn't have to use up a lot of energy on that. Like, let's be honest, our brains take a lot of energy. And so the way that we get around that is the brain only focuses on the things that are really important, right? So in driving home, it's going to predict all of those things as much as it can around you and only focus on the things that are different. So in the example here, our brains are tuned to focus on anomalies. Anomalies meaning something different, something unusual. The red fish in this image, that's what we focus on, right? Because that's what we're all about. It's like we can't take in everything, so let's just take in the thing that's different, the thing that's unique. And that's how we learn. We keep learning by noticing the different anomalies and then growing and adding that data to our brains. And so here's just a quick quote from Dr. Stephenson. He was a neuroscientist I interviewed. And he said, "When our brain is doing its job at predicting our surroundings, our subconscious is in control. Only when there is an error or something doesn't match our predicted reality does the conscious brain kick in. Only then do we become aware and notice the element that's different." All right, so that's really, really important. So in other words, we can't take everything in. We have to predict as much as we can. It's just like the NSA. Like they're out there listening to all of our stuff, but not everything. I mean, they can't, right? They can't listen to everything. So we just have to focus on the things, the conversations, the moments that really, really matter. And that's how our brain works. It's all about that focusing and anticipating and then engaging on the anomaly. So now let's talk about that. So now that we know that our brain is focused on anomalies, let's focus on how we make decisions with those 2 systems. So let's say you encounter a new situation, or you encounter a situation. Let's say there's a fire in front of you, and you want to know, should I touch that fire? Should I put my hand in there? The first thing that we do is we'll take this new experience and we'll connect back to, it's like our archive of all of our past decisions, all of our past experiences, and we'll do a quick scan, like a little search through all of that data. If we find a match, then the way that we remember that is there'll be a quick burst of emotion that'll remind us about that experience. And so our brain will be flooded with that quick emotion. And how do we know that? There's a thing called spindle neurons. Like in most animals, most neurons are these short, little teeny, like there's a big bunch with a little short tail. But in humans, we have spindle neurons that have these big, long tails that wrap all around throughout our whole brains. So that the smallest fluctuation in one of our neurochemicals, like dopamine or serotonin, the smallest fluctuation can alert the whole brain. So that way we don't have to wait for one little thing to happen, like a memory can be flooded back in with a little bit of neurochemicals and it'll flood our brain and we'll remember it. So again, fire, our brain will say, don't put your hand in there. It'll just be a quick hit. That's it. But what happens if we encounter a situation where we don't know what's going on? We walk up to this brazier with big purple flames coming out of it. And we're like, in some movies, this looks kind of magical. Should I touch that? Maybe it'll teleport me somewhere, right? We don't know what that is. So it's a new experience. And what happens in that one is, again, we go back to the catalog. Nope, no memory with purple flames. So then what do? That's when an anomaly happens. And that's when your conscious brain or your CEO kicks in, your logic. And your prefrontal cortex will start kicking in and say, okay, this is a new situation. Let's weigh the pros and cons. This is exactly what was happening with Antonio Damasio's patients. They were just going in logically and saying every single decision, there was nothing to reference. It was all about what are we logically trying to decide. And that's a slow process. That's like when you're driving past the ambulance. Everything slows down because you're taking in every little detail and processing that information and trying to make a memory. And once you make a decision, great, then what happens? Then we have to burn in a new memory. And the way this works is it's almost like the CEO, your logic says, okay, we've made a decision, folks, let's send it on back, and it'll go back to your subconscious, into the rest of your brain, and we'll lay down a memory trace. In other words, like all those neurons, there's going to be a little fire of neurochemicals between those neurons. And really, if you think about it, it's almost like, that's how we figure out a memory, right? First we have an anomaly, and then we have to use neurochemicals to lock down that memory trace. Here's how memory trace works. It's almost like whenever you've dealt with computers where it's ones and zeros, that's exactly what's going on in our head. All those millions of neurons are just firing in a unique pattern, like on, off, whatever it may be, ones and zeros. And when it fires in that pattern, the way it does that is through the release of neurochemicals. Now, what are neurochemicals? Serotonin, dopamine, all of those things are really emotions, right? That's how it's been explained, is that little burst of neurochemicals is how we trigger emotions. That's how we feel happy, sad, bored, annoyed, all of those things, proud. That's part of neurochemicals firing between neurons. And that's how the neurons communicate. So a little burst of neurochemicals or a little burst of emotion fires in a certain pattern and creates a memory. That memory trace is now locked into our brain because of an emotion. So it's an emotional tag that holds it there. And that's really, really important. So it's not just when we make a memory, those emotions are present, but also when we retrieve memories, right? In studies, like when people have a hard time remembering things, it's because the emotions have lessened, or maybe it wasn't an emotional moment and so it didn't lock in really strong, right? That's super, super important when we're making memories. So emotions are powerful, and the more emotion means a stronger memory. Let's go back to our example of 9/11. That was a very emotional experience, and all of us have strong memories about that because of all the emotions that were happening. So you have to have a lot of emotion present to lock down a memory, and you have to have a lot of emotion present to retrieve a memory. And so as things fade further on, in life, if we can keep emotional experiences around it, that's how we can keep those memories strong. So here's a really, really interesting thought. If you stop and think about the difference between logic and emotion, our slow system creates those logical little decisions, right? And then we lock them into an emotional memory. But if you think about what our emotions are, it's really just the brain retrieving back a whole bunch of past logical decisions, right? So all of our memory, those are just emotions that have locked in past decisions, past experiences. So if you think about it, the reality is logic and emotion are the same thing. Emotion is the same, it's just a whole bunch of logic. It's a whole bunch of past logic. So those two things are not enemies. They're not things that we need to say, oh, either you need to be rational or you need to be not be emotional, or we need to be emotional. It's the same thing. Emotions and logic are one. So when you really understand that, it's really enlightening to be like, oh, these are just different expressions of the same function, and they don't have to be at odds. All right, so now that we understand that, now when we make a decision, and we've got that all locked in there, now you see why there's a flood of emotion. So let me go back to another quote by Dr. Stephenson. He said, when making a decision and locking in a memory, emotions are everything. In neuroscience, there's another expression. Neurons that fire together, wire together. In other words, the more activity you have in a certain pathway, the more it becomes plastic. And that plasticity is mediated by certain neurotransmitters and chemicals, also known as the regulators of emotion. So when we make a decision, our brains are flooded with feelings. To me, that is fascinating. That's how it all comes together, how those two parts work together. And now I want to go back to the question we asked in the beginning. We talked about it from a historical lens, but now that you understand how the brain works, how we make decisions, how emotions and logic work together, and how you can't have one without the other, it's really, really important. So I want you to think about this question again. Do you, or should we, place more value on logic or emotion? In thinking through in marketing terms or in business terms, predominantly we put the focus on logic, making sound business decisions. And we feel like emotion is something that we should suppress and push back. But when you really understand the brain, that's not how it works at all. In fact, the answer to this question is it's a trick question, but the answer is it's both. In all brains, we have both logic and emotion. We have that same thing present in concentrated efforts and in smaller efforts. And so it's really important to know that in business, it's not a matter of saying, let's ignore and let's push past the emotion and focus on being rational, or on the opposite. If we want to be super zany creative, it's not all about like, let's just stop thinking logically about stuff and let's just get into Zen. Like, that's not it at all. Oftentimes I joke that I'm a central brainer, and that, no, I don't have a third brain right between my hemispheres, but I do understand that it's a well-rounded thing. It's full brain experiences, full brain marketing. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how those two comes together. So the answer is both. All right, but the question isn't, all right, is it more or less of the other? There are certain times where we need to focus on one or the other to make the right decision. For example, there are a lot of studies on making big, extremely complex decisions versus very easy and simple decisions. And if you think it in terms of like a computer versus a calculator, there are still times today that we'll go out and be like, oh, I just got to do some math. I'm just going to take out a calculator and do it real quick, right? But there are times that I really need to dig into a problem, and maybe I need to, use a computer and all the processing power of a computer to figure that out. It's the same thing with our systems. If you think about just shorthand, your logical system is more like the calculator. It can't hold a lot of variables, but it's quick and fast, it's slow, but it can handle very specific situations, right? Where you really need to just that answer. And your subconscious or your fast system is really like the big computer. It's vast, it's enormous, and it can help you calculate big questions and big decisions. I'm not going to go deep into the studies, but there are some on like, let's say you're making a quick decision around a vegetable peeler. There aren't a lot of variables on a vegetable peeler. It's like, what's the color of it? What's the shape? Is it ergonomic? That's about it, right? And when you go to a decision like that, the best answer is use logic. Do I like that color? Do I like this? Crunch the numbers, done. But what about more complex buying decisions? What about something like buying a car or buying a house that are huge decisions, right? They're very emotionally draining. And now when we look at how all this works, it's very easy to understand. Those are situations that you should probably use more of your emotions to answer that. For example, when you walk into a new home and you're shopping for a new house, you could just walk in and instantly feel if it feels right, right? Like you feel it. But what's going on underneath the hood is your brain is calculating a whole bunch of decisions. It's saying, all right, we know, from past experiences, we like a lot of light. We don't like dark wood. We like light wood. We like countertops that are like this. We like space here. We definitely need space for, the front room or for the dog or for the 3 kids, whatever it may be. Your brain is going back to all those past experiences and quickly understanding the layout and then using an emotion to go back to you and say, this is the right answer. So it's all about, feeling our guts and really tapping into those emotions to make really good decisions. And here's what I'm saying, is that now that you understand the balance of these two and using them in the right moments, it's no longer about creativity versus strategy like it was in the 70s. It's not about branding versus direct marketing. It's not about art versus science or right brain versus left brain. It's about both. It's about understanding the needs and the uses of both types of expressions and using them in the right instance. So here's another fun thing that I read articles on. There are a lot of people who say, oh, today we are in this new world of data-driven marketing. We have so much data, so much information. We know what our customers like. We don't have to guess anymore, right? Therefore, the marketing gut is dead. And I would even use that beyond just marketing. It could also be like our business gut. We don't need any of that. We don't need people who have been in the trenches and understand it, because now we have data. We can just get straight past it and we're not biased. But I'd say that is completely wrong. If you think about your marketing gut or your business gut just as the way your brains work, which is, what are all the past experiences? What is all the logic I've used in the past? What are all the decisions I've made? What are the experiences I've had that have taught me good and bad things? And I'm just quickly tapping into that, into my emotions, to quickly know if a decision is right or wrong. That makes complete sense to me. So the marketing gut is not dead. It's alive and well. The business gut is not dead. It's all about using those emotions, using those past experiences as like a mini supercomputer to help communicate back to you things that you've already experienced. That's a phenomenal thing. So now that we understand that, we've gotten through all the neuroscience and the studies, at least for now. Now I want to switch and start talking about, what does this mean in terms of marketing or other decisions or real world examples? How do we take all this learning and apply it to something that we're going to use day to day? All right, so the first thing I want to talk about is attention span. And this one's a great one. Because here's how the myth goes. The myth is, oh, we have attention span and our attention span is shrinking. And now we have the attention span that's less than that of a goldfish. A goldfish has like 8 seconds, and now we're down to like 5. And so, whoa, the world is falling apart. Now we have to make stuff faster and deliver in smaller chunks. In fact, this trend that I've seen in content creation is that it's really all about creating snackable content, right? We're so used to our phones and the feed that everything we need to create needs to be snackable. It needs to be short, punchy, and something that you can digest really, really fast, right? And it's funny that there was even a study last March that said they studied content and marketing and advertising and hooked people up to brain scans, and they came up with this idea. They said it's now our attention spans are so fast that instead of having a marketing plan that's like a 30-second TV spot or a 10-second online video spot, now you need to focus on the 1-second strategy. Because things that they learned from the study is, oh yeah, people can look at an ad and within 0.4 of a second, they'll know if they like it or don't like it and move on, right? When we're in our feed, moving through stuff on mobile, we can just instantly say, oh, forget it, I hate that thing, I'm moving on. Or, ooh, I like that, I'm gonna stay. And so they attribute it to attention span, that it's all about capturing that attention within a second. And here's a takeaway from their study. They said the implications of these findings suggest that although brands have been trained to develop 15 or 30-second creative and media strategies, or even 6 and 7-second strategies, marketers should now develop plans and strategies that address the first 1 second. Gulp. All right, so we're in this world of super fast speed, right? And that, to a lot of people, that is scary. That is saying, rethink everything you've done with business, with science, with everything, because when you're dealing with people or consumers, you have 1 second to get them, right? I want to hold up my hand and say, I think we're off a little bit here. There's really more to the story. Because if you think back on everything that we just learned about how the brain works, right? It's, in so many times in marketing pitches, I've always heard we're inundated with hundreds or even thousands of ads, and therefore the only way to get through is if you really focus on that 1-second strategy. But when you think about what the brain is doing, think about the input devices, all the sight, sound, all that data flowing in. Our brains can make a decision, I would say even less than 0.4 of a second. In milliseconds, our brains can figure something out. Why? Because that's how they were built. They were built to figure out what are the important things I need to attend to, what's the anomaly, and ignore everything else. So in reality, it has nothing to do with time. Trying to do things faster, smaller chunks. There's all this stuff out there about your website, the content has to be above the fold. If you're going to do, an ad, it's got to be super short. If you're going to write a headline, it's got to be 3 words because people aren't going to read past that. And now if we go back, and I want to dig into this a little bit and focus on the fact that it's not about the length or time or speed or any of those things. There is a study done by Paul A. Zak. He's the father of neuroeconomics. I want to bring up one more study here. And he was trying to figure out, he had this experience where he was watching a movie, and then at the end he was like, it was such an emotional movie, if they'd asked me to pay money for some cause, I would have done it in a second. No questions. And so he went back to the lab and tried to figure out, how do we figure out how people can look at ads or look at things and know if they're going to pay money, right? So his formula was, he figured out it's what we needed to get to the money, which is the action. What do we need? And this is what he found. He found that it was attention plus emotion. So backing up to what we've already talked about, attention, meaning are the people focused on it? Is it an anomaly? That's attention. Attention span isn't this mysterious thing that's out there that we just have a limited quantity of it. Not at all. Your brain is just out there scanning, and it's going to focus on the things that it finds that are an anomaly. So is it an anomaly? If it's an anomaly, it's going to focus on it, right? And then the next step is there enough emotion present? Thinking back to how we make decisions, right? If you have emotion present on that anomaly and we make a choice around it, that's when we're going to lock in a memory and keep a memory and retrieve a memory, right? Only if those 2 things are present does that matter. And just to talk a little bit about that in more detail, we think about media buys. If I put an ad out there, and a lot of times media science would say, in order for that to stick, you have to deliver it 3 times with a repeating factor of X. I would say it doesn't matter how many times you're exposed to something, exposed to that attention or that anomaly. It's all a matter of how much emotion is present. Think back to the 9/11 experience. That happened once. There are a lot of people who have PTSD of an experience that happened once. And because it was such an emotional experience, that is locked in their head forever, and they'll never forget it. So when we want to take action, you have to find an anomaly and make sure there's a lot of emotion present, not just a little bit of emotion, but the right amount of emotion. That will equal action. So Paul Zak, the way he would do this is he went through and figured out, all right, attention I can measure through, heart rate and pulse and sweat glands, and I can see if people are focused on the thing. And then the way he figured out to measure emotion was hold on a second. And the way he figured out emotion was through the vagus nerve, because that had a lot of serotonin, right? And he could measure the amounts of it. So he could say, was this an emotional experience when they looked at this ad, or was it not? And he could guess up to like an 80-something% chance, if you watch something, if people would pay money for it or not, just by looking at it and measuring it. Now, the lesson for us is, in the real world, me as a marketer, I can't go up and hook up every single customer to a machine, an EKG machine or whatever it may be, scan their brain, have them watch my ad, and then decide if it's a good ad, right? I can't do that. But things that I can do is I can go out and focus on, is there an anomaly? Is there something unique and different? And then is it emotional? Am I tapping into their past experiences, either through like nostalgia or humor or insight or whatever it may be, and wrapping that anomaly in this emotional blanket? That I can do. So that's an easy way to know if you're creating great experiences, is if you have those two things. Now, going back to that, when we go back to that 1 second thing, it's not content, things we create. Attention span isn't about capturing their attention really fast. It's about, are you delivering something of value? Are you delivering an anomaly with an emotional impact that has value to that audience? If it does, they will give you all the attention in the world. It's not just a millisecond, they will give you lots of attention. So if you're looking at the phone example, as you're scanning through your feed, people stop on something that catches their attention. It's not because it's fast. It's not because it's about time, speed, or length. It's because it's emotional or it's an anomaly tied together. It has value. That is what we should be creating. Content and things, experiences, businesses that provide value to the person. That's how you're going to hold their attention and keep them. And now, to be fair, I've been harping on snackable content, right? And that's probably not fair, because there is a time and a place for all types of content. This is a pyramid that I learned during grad school at Northwestern University. And it talks about the different types of discussions and engagements. So at the top are shallow discussions, and at the bottom are deeper engagements. And there is a time and a place for something short and quick and fast on social. Maybe that's totally fine. But if you really want to engage to a deeper level, you're going to ladder down to these other things. Like you want to get to more of a website or a thought leadership article or a video that's longer or a community. Once they've engaged with you, that's really important. So certainly at the top, you can start shallow and then make sure you're giving enough value in your content that pushes people down into the experience. And this isn't just with marketing, this is business too. Like make sure your app, you can quickly talk about something of value that's interesting at the top, a hook, and then slowly get them deeper into the product. Now, another way that we've taken a lot of this, these two different systems of thought and everything, is the time and a place for a brand or a company to use their voice. So when I think of this, like this is a crazy eye chart, but it's our tone hierarchy that we use at Adobe in having experiences that are with the brand. So if you think about it as a funnel, at level 1 is the top of the funnel. These are like people who are just barely getting engaged with your company, versus all the way down to level 5 where they're ready to take action. At the level 1, that's all about your emotional system. Remember, your emotional system is your fast system. It's going to kick in first. Therefore, headlines and writing and things, like the tone should be engaging, emotional, and thought-provoking. Your top of funnel stuff should be that. It should be more emotional. It doesn't matter whether you're an IT person or a creative or a marketer or an engineer. It doesn't matter. Like, we're all human, and our fast system kicks in first. So make sure videos, content, anything is emotional and thought-provoking or whatever it may be at the top of the funnel. Then as you get deeper into the experience, just like going down that pyramid, then you can get deeper into more logical decisions. Like when I get to a call to action, a button on my website should just say, get the article, read the paper, buy now. Like that's it. We shouldn't get fancy with the lower funnel stuff. Just focus on emotions at the top, and then you get more into your rational system as you go through the funnel. So that's just a good thing to understand in marketing. So let's go back to that 1 second thing. The 1 second study said our brain engages in 4/10 of a second. That was correct. We can trigger an imprint in milliseconds. Absolutely correct. What they got wrong is it's not about speed or time. It's all about that quality of content. So when we're talking, if it's about attention span, don't think of attention span. Think of how do I hold attention, how do I get attention, and then how do I turn that into something of value? Because that's what content's all about. Content is about value. You've got to deliver value. But remember that formula, anomaly plus emotion. All right, next, another topic. How do we measure creative ideas? How do we find out if something is really good? And the funny thing is, in the past, here's how we measure today. We'll go out and we'll say, oh, we're too scared to just put something in the market, so let's do focus groups. Let's go out and check with the audience and see if they like this thing, and that'll give us a good gut check with a small audience. Or we do an online survey because we're like, oh, good, we can get at a small survey chunk that represents the whole audience, and that'll give us a good indication. Or we'll go out and talk to experts, or we'll go out and crowdsource something and just say, let's just throw it to our audience, right? The problem with all of these formulas, all of these methods, is they're focused on logic. And I'm not even going to go too off on focus groups, because when people come in and sit down, they're not truly expressing their emotions. They're putting on their logical hat and saying, all right, these people are paying me $25. They want an answer. What should I tell them? I got to just tell them right now something that's really important, right? And surveys and everything, it's really just tapping into what's a logical answer. And we're really not getting at what is the emotional response. Because emotion is going to happen in real life. It's going to happen in the experience. So there are some ways we're getting around this. At Adobe, we were working with a company that would put something on you. You could measure your emotional experience as you're going through watching some ad or something. And like I said, putting people in the lab or testing them is really hard. So we could try and test some people's emotions and see how it's going. But honestly, I feel like the better answer, the answer that's opposite of data-driven marketing, is creative-driven marketing, which means instead of just guessing and being too scared, try something low in the market, like do some social ads, do an email campaign, and put out a whole bunch of content right from the start, and then see which things people like, and just see in the real world what they like. Like, it doesn't have to be that expensive. And once you find the experiences that people are loving, then you just double down on that and use that good data to build the right experience at the top. So again, remember Paul Zach's formula in this. If we want to get those good experiences, get attention anomaly, find the emotion, and then therefore we get to action. And another way to think about it in terms is this. If you're looking at that anomaly and that emotion, here's another way of thinking about it. As a marketer or a business person, the first thing you want to do is you want to go out with a little bit of logic. So instead of testing creative ideas, instead of testing whether your product with a focus group is going to work, go out there and use data for insights. Go out there and understand the audience. What do they care about? What are their emotions? What are their triggers? What are the things that they're really having a hard time with? Really dig in. If you're going to dig in with your logic, dig in on that and use data to establish those triggers. Then go out and create an experience. And the way we test this is, does it have an anomaly, which is unusual, and does it have empathy? Does it have an emotion? And then the way you measure that is simply go back and say, does my experience that I created tie back to those triggers that I used from logic? And if they do, then you have a high chance that it's going to connect. Remember, Paul Zach could figure out from 82% accuracy. You can certainly look at those triggers, create an anomaly, add the emotion around it, and then if you're connected to that, you can rest assured you're probably going to have a good response. Okay, last one. I'm just going to go through one more example. And this is the classic marketing pitch, but I want to give it to you with a neuroscience perspective, all the stuff that we learned early on. So, in my experience in advertising and marketing and business, this is how we've given the pitch of how we connect with customers. And it goes like this. The first thing you have to do is get noticed. There are a million ads out there and people aren't paying attention, and so everything you do may fly under the radar. So in order to do it, you have to do something creative and exciting, and that's how you get noticed. And then what you do is you have to be engaging, meaning you have to have good personality, and you have to have something that's interesting, and then that's what we call stickiness. It'll stick with them. And finally, if it's actually true, funny, advertising truth, if it's actually true, then people will believe it. And then finally, if you can keep doing that consistently, people will remember it, and that you'll have brand preference. And as long as you don't screw it up and lie and mess up, then you'll finally have customer loyalty. And so we've been talking about this formula, and this is really how customers flow into loyalty, but we haven't really understood a lot of it. So I want to dig into all those real quick and talk about what's really going on with the brain and what's happening. So first, getting noticed. What does that mean? There are three things that could happen, right? It could be that the message you put out is just wallpaper. Like, it's the same message that a million other people have done. And remember, just like the example when we were driving past the ambulance, if there's no ambulance and you're on autopilot, your brain doesn't attend to it. There's no anomaly, nothing. If there's no anomaly, it just goes under the radar. Your brain's not even going to light up. Now let's say you're like, okay, we should have messages or videos or marketing that is just the facts. I'm a salesperson, just tell them the facts and give them information, and enough with the fluffy stuff, enough with the emotional crap. That's stupid. That's good marketing. That's good logic, right? What's going to happen? If you do that and you only have the anomaly, what's the best that could happen? Your prefrontal cortex lights up, your brain will make a little decision about it, and that's it. It's only going to light up part of your brain. But when you do the whole formula, you have the anomaly plus emotion plus the creativity. That's when the whole brain lights up, because you're tapping into emotions and the anomaly, and it's paying attention with everything, and it's using all the emotional juice to light up your whole brain. So if you want to get noticed, anomaly and emotion. Absolutely. Number 2, sticky. What does sticky mean? So we don't retain everything. Remember, back to the neuroscience quote from Dr. Stephenson. We only retain the things that we attend to, which means if you want someone to remember you, you have to have brain activity in that area. You have to have those emotional experiences in that area more and more and more, right? The way that you get sticky is by having an emotional experience. Here's a really cool story about this. So there's a whole book called, by Eric Duplessis, The Advertised Mind. And they went out and studied hundreds and hundreds of ads and brand experiences. And they broke it down into like, what were the most important factors that made one ad work versus all these other ads that didn't work. And back then they were thinking, oh, maybe it's all about time, length, right? So it's like if we have a big, huge media buy with big, long 60-second ads or a big magazine spread or a whole web page, that's what people will care about. And what they found is it had nothing to do with media. It had nothing to do with time, length, or anything. The most important thing was likability. So was it liked? That takes us to the next step of, it's not a matter of, are you sending the messages out there, but is that message liked? Meaning, does it have a positive experience? Does it an emotional experience? And when we lock in a memory. And to be honest, we always fight about, should we show shock value like news? Because there's a lot of emotion in shock value, and that works for news. But a lot of times for brands and other things, it doesn't work out because people don't like locking in that negativity. They actually have better experiences on it if it's being liked. So if it's liked, it's a positive experience. That's when we're going to have a better chance of them locking in an emotional memory trace. That's what we need. So liked is use positive emotions. Next, is it remembered? Again, the more emotion that's present, the greater the chance you're going to lock in a memory. And the more emotion that's present when you try and bring back that memory, the greater chance of retrieval. So even when you're running ads that are supposed to be to existing customers, that's why it's so much more expensive to get a new customer than it is to get to upsell an existing customer, because you already have that emotional baggage with them. You already have all that nostalgia. If you want to tap into that, that's your chance of bringing back those memories. That's why we use nostalgia to bring it back and remember those things, and then that way they're more inclined to buy or purchase, right? So retrieval is all about make sure there's memory present when you lock the memory, and make sure you have a lot of emotion present when, make sure there's emotion present when you lock in the memory, and make sure you have a lot of emotion present when they're bringing it back. And then finally, loyalty. The more traces, the more things that are burned in your memory is a greater chance of plasticity. So in other words, trust and loyalty. So you just have to keep doing it over time, and then you'll get loyalty. So hopefully that all made sense in terms of what's really going on in the brain when we make decisions and when we have brand experiences or business experiences. All right, now I want to go back to Russell's question that I started out in the very beginning of this experience. Russell asked, do creative ideas work better? I hope that by everything that you've learned or everything that I've shared, you can see how emotions are really, really, really important in creating branding experiences, business experiences, everything you do. You can't just ignore emotion and just be a logical human being. It's not there. And even though I know, there are many personalities that like to just be more logical, and that's totally fine, but everyone still has emotion present. So understanding the balance of logic and emotion is critical, especially today. We're talking today about, there's been an unprecedented era of data. For like the last 10 years, it's been data, data, data. All this technology that we've been using has really pushed us to really understand more and more and more about humans. But all the data in the world isn't going to solve it. It's still that balance of humanity. Like you still need the EQ with the AI, with the artificial intelligence. It's never going to be separated. So balancing logic and emotion is critical in making experiences. And when it comes to creativity, creativity is a huge part of all this. Creativity is the emotion part. If you want to think of logic as the anomaly and emotion as the creativity part, that's where we need creativity. In fact, some people have talked about how creativity is really the scientific method. It's the scientific method in action. Because we're going out there and we're creating these moments, these experiences, where we're bringing something together, a new emotional experience. Let me just, one of my favorite quotes of what is an experience, Brian Solis said, it's an emotional connection to a moment. That's what an experience is, an emotional connection to a moment. So when we're going out there as creatives and making these emotional connections to moments or products or people or places, we're testing. We're just out there trying like, all right, here's an experiment. We think this emotion is going to catch on with this audience, and we try it. And especially in like, short form stuff like, social media, we can go out there really, really fast and we can test something. We can put an ad out there, and if people react to it and like it, great, we know that worked. That's a scientific method in action. Or if we want to try a different creative and it doesn't work, great, that failed. But think of the creativity as the scientific method, and think of creativity as that emotion. And when you go out there and create experiences, you create brands, you create businesses, make sure you have enough logic and data balanced with your creativity. Art and science working perfectly together. That's the answer. If you want to impact the bottom line, then absolutely creative ideas you can't ignore them. If you want to avoid risk in your business, if you want to avoid risk in your pursuits of excellent and new knowledge, you cannot ignore creativity. Creativity and emotion has to be present because that's where you're going to make those new leaps. That's where you're going to find experiences that change the world. Thank you. All right, since I'm not there live with you and we can't have a Q&A, I thought I'd try a different way of doing Q&A. So here on the screen is my personal email address. And I usually like to think of this more in terms of, those who are introverts versus extroverts. If you're an extrovert, there's my email. Email me, ask me a question, and we'll talk about it. If you're an introvert, I've put up a landing page on my website at adamwmorgan.com/Virginia, and you can go there and there'll be a place where you can download this deck, or you can connect with me and we can answer all your questions. So we will take some time virtually to answer all your questions and get to know you. And if you're interested, if you want to know more about all of this, my book, Sorry Spock, Emotions Drive Business, Proving the Value of Creativity Through Science, you can find that on any platform, from Amazon to whatever. And feel free to look through the book. There's a lot more in that. Or go to my website, adamwmorgan.com, and you can sign up to my newsletter, and I write articles all the time, and I'll just share it with everyone. So join and engage with me, and I'd love to get your questions and connect. Thank you so much.